Deep in the misty heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where the wind speaks and hushes through the trees and snowmelt runs cold along forgotten trails, an old man stumbled upon something that would change two lives forever. A dying German Shepherd K9, tossed aside like broken equipment, left to perish alone beside an icy stream. But what he didn't know was that this moment wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something miraculous, a bond forged not by chance, but perhaps by fate itself. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe that animals deserve love, not pain, if you believe that second chances are written in the stars, then hit that subscribe button, because this story is going to stay with you long after the final word is spoken. The first light of morning barely touched the mist-draped forests of the Appalachian foothills, outside a quiet town called Maple Hollow, North Carolina. Winter lingered here longer than most places, its breath still etched in frost across the ground. Pines swayed gently in the wind, their branches whispering secrets older than the town itself. Snow hadn't fallen, but the cold was bone-deep, and the air was heavy with moisture, making each breath visible and each footstep damp. 74-year-old Caleb Whitmore moved slowly along a narrow trail, worn only by his own boots and the paws of forest creatures. He was a man shaped by solitude and seasons, tall, wiry, with a frame hardened by years of labor. His silver hair was tucked beneath a thick canvas cap, and his beard, trimmed neatly, framed a face both stern and kind. His eyes were gray like river stones, sharp with caution, but softened by memory. Once a forest ranger, Caleb had retired to the very woods he'd patrolled for decades, finding peace in the hush between trees. A handmade satchel hung over his shoulder, filled with rope, tools, and a weather-worn field journal. This morning, like many before, he'd ventured out to check his humane animal traps. Simple wooden cages baited for raccoons, foxes, or the occasional opossum that wandered too close to his garden. The forest around him was alive with stillness, the kind only those who'd lived long in its arms could truly hear. As he crossed a narrow bridge of moss-covered stones, a sudden sound broke the quiet. It was faint, almost lost in the hush of the stream beneath. A whimper. Caleb paused. The sound came again, sharper this time. Not the bark of a fox or the call of a bird. It was pain, living pain. His instincts flared. He stepped off the path, following the sound down toward the bank of a shallow creek. Mist rose from the water like smoke, clinging to the undergrowth. And there, half hidden beneath a tangle of roots and icy mud, was a dog. Not just any dog. A German Shepherd, large and muscular, though now gaunt with exhaustion. Its fur was soaked and matted with dirt and blood. One leg bent at a sickening angle. Its breathing was labored, sides rising and falling too fast. The dog's eyes flicked toward Caleb, unfocused but alert, deep brown with fear and something else. Resolve. Caleb knelt slowly, careful not to startle it. The dog gave a faint growl, more warning than threat, but didn't move. Around its neck was a heavy-duty black collar, scuffed and splattered with dried blood. Embedded in the collar was a small metal plate. Caleb leaned in and wiped it clean with the edge of his sleeve. Ranger, K9 Unit, Naja 472, Red Oak PD. A police dog. Injured, abandoned. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The sight tore through something inside him, unlocking a memory long buried. Years ago, he had owned a bloodhound named Boone. Loyal, wild-hearted, a creature of joy and instinct. Boone had been his partner in the field, tracking missing hikers and chasing bears from trash bins. But cancer came fast. The day Caleb buried Boone beneath the hill behind his cabin, he had sworn never to love another dog. Yet here lay another soul, not his, but like his. Wounded, alone, thrown away by the world it once served. Caleb pulled off his gloves and reached out, murmuring softly, "Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." The German Shepherd didn't flinch, just blinked once, then closed its eyes as if surrendering. Using a wool blanket from his satchel, Caleb wrapped the dog gently, lifting with both arms. It was heavier than expected, all muscle under the wounds. He felt the dog's chest rise against his own, each breath a quiet struggle. The trail back to his cabin was uphill and icy, and Caleb's knees protested every step, but he pressed forward, Back at the cabin, a squat log structure nestled between old oaks and pine, he laid the dog on a thick rug near the fireplace. The wood stove crackled softly, casting amber light on the animal's fur. Caleb retrieved a first aid kit and began tending to the worst of the wounds: deep gashes along the flank, a swollen leg, bruises that told of brutal handling. As he worked, he spoke aloud, not to the dog exactly, but to the silence that had filled his home for too many winters. "You're lucky I found you," he muttered. "Or maybe I'm the lucky one." He poured warm water into a bowl and watched as the dog, though weak, lifted its head and drank slowly. The name on the collar came back to him: Ranger. A name that sounded more like a title. "You served somebody, didn't you?" Caleb whispered. "And they left you out there like garbage." He sat back, exhaustion washing over him, but his heart beat faster than it had in years. This wasn't just a dog. This was a life cast aside by a world that no longer needed it. And for reasons Caleb didn't yet understand, he had been chosen to find it. The snow began falling outside the window, soft as ash, settling on the earth like a promise. Inside, by the firelight, Ranger slept. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel alone. The sky outside the cabin had turned a dull gray, thick clouds rolling in, low and slow, like an old bear settling into its den. A light drizzle began tapping against the tin roof, adding a rhythm to the silence inside. The cabin, built from hand-hewn pine logs and insulated with decades of wood smoke and solitude, stood firm in the cold morning. Inside, it smelled of cedar, wet dog, and something boiling on the stove, bones and marrow, simmering gently in a dented cast-iron pot. Caleb Whitmore moved with quiet purpose. His joints ached from the morning's trek, but his mind was alert, sharpened by the urgency of caring for the animal lying curled near the fire. The dog, Ranger, hadn't moved much since they arrived. Only his eyes tracked Caleb's motion, wary and quiet, like a soldier too tired to stand, but unwilling to stop fighting. Ranger's fur was still damp, despite the towels Caleb had used. The blood had clotted along his ribs, dried like rust against the tan and black coat. Caleb sat beside him on the wooden floor, an old wool blanket folded between his knees and the dog's trembling body. He opened a battered metal first aid box, its contents neatly arranged: iodine, gauze, scissors, even an old tourniquet from his ranger days. "All right, son," Caleb muttered. "This'll sting." He poured warm water over a rag and pressed it gently to the worst of the wounds. Ranger flinched but didn't growl. His body tensed, held tight like a wire drawn taut. But he didn't lash out. Caleb noticed the obedience. Not just tolerance, training. This wasn't a dog that had simply been mistreated. This was a professional, a soldier. "You're used to following orders, huh?" Caleb said quietly. "Well, consider this one: survive." Once the wounds were cleaned and dressed, Caleb draped a dry flannel blanket over the dog's back and stoked the fire. He moved to the stove, lifted the lid off the simmering pot, and the scent of marrow-rich broth filled the room. He ladled some into a small bowl and placed it near Ranger's nose. The dog sniffed. Tentatively, then with growing hunger, he began to drink. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin, nudging the shutters like old ghosts. Caleb sat in his worn armchair, one hand holding a mug of the same broth. The radio on the mantel buzzed to life, a shortwave set he rarely used, now tuned to the county's emergency broadcast channel. Repeat: the incident at Echo Ridge resulted in 2 officers injured, suspect vehicle abandoned near mile marker 12, 1 K9 unit unaccounted for. Last seen in pursuit along the river trail. Caleb straightened. The voice was clipped, businesslike, but the words cut through the fog in his head. "Ranger," he said, glancing at the dog, who had stopped drinking and was watching him again. Their eyes locked. For a moment, it felt like confirmation. Echo Ridge was 20 miles north, as the crow flies. But for a dog, following a fleeing suspect, through forest and rain and night? "You ran yourself damn near dead," Caleb murmured, "and they left you out there to rot." He rubbed a hand down his face, then took another sip of broth. Across the room, Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of the wind. The fire crackled, casting a golden hue over the cabin's interior, shelves lined with field books, old photographs, antlers, and one framed picture of a large hound with mournful eyes. "Boone." Caleb's voice softened. I never thought I'd bring another dog in this house. Guess life doesn't care what we think. That night, as the rain intensified, Caleb made a bed of towels and blankets near the fire. Ranger shifted onto it slowly, settling down with a long, exhausted sigh. Caleb stretched out on the couch nearby, blanket over his legs, the radio still muttering in the background. He stared at the ceiling. Through the gaps in the beams, he could hear the wind moving through the high branches outside, whistling between the pines. The dog didn't whimper again. In his sleep, Caleb dreamed of Boone, bounding through wildflowers, barking joyfully. When he woke just before dawn, he found Ranger awake, head resting on his paws, watching him in silence. The blanket had slid from his back, and his tail thumped gently once against the floor. A beginning. Not trust, not yet. But something close. And outside, for the first time in days, the rain had stopped. The morning broke clearer than any in recent weeks. Sunlight slanted through the tall pines outside Caleb's cabin, dappling the wooden floor with golden shafts. The forest, still damp from days of rain, seemed to hold its breath. Birds chattered cautiously in the distance, and a squirrel scurried past the porch with renewed purpose. Inside, the fire had died to embers, but warmth lingered in the air. Ranger lay near the hearth, his head lifted slightly now, ears twitching at the morning sounds. His wounds had started to scab, and though still sore, his posture had changed. Less fear. More awareness. Caleb, noticing the alertness in the dog's eyes, squatted beside him and whispered, "You're coming back to life, huh?" The dog thumped his tail once, deliberately. Caleb rose and crossed to the small writing desk beneath the window. There, beside a stack of weathered maps and utility bills, lay a portable RFID scanner, something he kept from his ranger days when identifying tagged wildlife was part of the job. He powered it on, knelt beside Ranger, and gently lifted the heavy collar still fastened around the dog's neck. The scanner blinked. A sequence of numbers lit up. K9 Unit 472, Red Oak Police Department. Chip ID RPD K9 472 A11. Handler, Officer, Jackson Clare. Caleb stared at the display a moment longer, then set the scanner aside. Red Oak, 20 miles south. He hadn't visited in years. Too many people, too many memories. But now he had a name, a traceable one. He pulled out the old rotary phone mounted on the wall and dialed the non-emergency number for the Red Oak PD. After a few clicks and beeps, a receptionist picked up, voice clipped, efficient. Caleb explained who he was, what he'd found, and read the chip number. A long pause. Then, "Please hold. Officer Clare will want to speak with you directly." Minutes later, a new voice came on the line. Younger, slightly hoarse, with a tone that cracked when Caleb repeated the chip ID. "You're saying Ranger's alive?" "I'm looking at him right now," Caleb replied. "He's bruised, cut up bad, but healing." There was silence. Then the sound of someone exhaling hard, like they'd been punched in the chest. "I'll be there within the hour," the officer said. "Please don't let anyone else near him." Exactly 55 minutes later, a black police cruiser pulled onto the muddy trail that led to Caleb's cabin. The man who stepped out was in his early 30s, tall and lean, with the posture of someone trained to stand straight, even when the world bent sideways. His uniform jacket was slightly wrinkled, his boots still muddy from past patrols. Jackson Clare had a square jaw, short brown hair, and eyes the color of burnt copper. There was something about the way he carried himself, alert yet unsure, that reminded Caleb of someone not used to being vulnerable. "You must be Mr. Whitmore," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I'm Officer Jackson Clare, Red Oak PD." Caleb gestured toward the open door. "He's inside, but he's still healing. Don't rush him." Jackson entered and froze when he saw Ranger. The dog raised his head, ears pricking forward. Jackson knelt, slow and cautious. "Ranger," he said softly. "Buddy, is that you?" Ranger stared for a long moment. Then, as if drawn by instinct or memory, he pulled himself up and took 2 limping steps forward. His nose touched Jackson's knee. The officer broke. He leaned down and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, pressing his face into the coarse fur. "I thought you were dead," he whispered. "I thought they left you to die." Caleb watched from the corner, arms folded, the faintest smile breaking through his weathered features. After several minutes, Jackson rose, wiping at his eyes quickly. "He disappeared during a takedown out near Echo Ridge," he explained. We were chasing a suspect into the woods. Shots were fired. I took a hit to the leg. Ranger kept going. When backup arrived, he was gone. We searched for days. Eventually, we had to assume the worst. Well, he's not the worst, Caleb replied. But he's seen it. Just then, a second vehicle pulled up outside. A dusty green pickup with a cracked windshield and the logo Cedar Hollow Animal Clinic stenciled on the side. The woman who stepped out was in her late 20s, slim, pale-skinned, with freckles across her cheeks and reddish-blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail under a denim cap. She wore a navy fleece jacket over scrubs, and a stethoscope dangled from her neck like a pendant. "Sophie Whitmore," she announced, brushing her boots off at the door. Uncle Caleb called and said he might need a second opinion. "Still playing vet in the wild?" Caleb asked with mock sarcasm. Sophie rolled her eyes. "Still refusing to go into town like a normal person?" The exchange was warm but barbed, the kind that only blood relatives with a rocky past could manage. Sophie was Caleb's only living family, daughter of his younger brother, and the two had grown apart after her parents' sudden death in a car crash years ago. Since then, Sophie had thrown herself into work and study, becoming a respected young vet known for taking cases others wouldn't. Still, something in her gaze softened when she saw the dog. She knelt beside Ranger and began examining him with practiced hands. "He's lucky," she murmured. "Nothing broken, deep lacerations, probably from barbed wire or a sharp fall, malnourished, dehydrated. But he's recovering faster than I expected." She glanced up. "You been feeding him soup again, Uncle?" Caleb grunted. "Bone broth. He earned it." Jackson reached for Ranger's collar. "We can bring him back to the station, get a full medical review, reintroduce him slowly." But Sophie held up a hand. "Not yet. He's only just started trusting again. Pull him into a sterile cage and you might undo what he's rebuilt here." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. "I just wanted to see him again. Thank you for not giving up on him." Caleb stood at the doorway, eyes narrowing toward the trees. "No one who's fought this hard deserves to be left behind." Inside, Ranger circled twice and laid back down near the fire. This time, he slept without twitching. The trees had begun their slow transformation, the greens of summer turning into fire, scarlets, ambers, and deep golds burning across the hills. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the frost to come, and every breath felt sharper, cleaner. Around the cabin, leaves drifted down like ancient confetti, carpeting the ground in silent ceremony. Inside, Caleb was unusually quiet. He stood at the window, hands curled around a chipped mug of black coffee, watching as Ranger rested near the porch. The dog's coat had regained some of its sheen, his eyes brighter now, body stronger. The bruises were gone, wounds faded to thin scars. His spirit, too, had shifted. Not quite healed, but no longer broken. Officer Jackson had returned that morning, dressed in a clean civilian jacket instead of his uniform. He had the look of a man trying not to act sentimental, but his voice betrayed it when he spoke. "We've arranged for Ranger to rejoin the unit next week. Not for duty," he added quickly, seeing Caleb's face tense. "He's earned his rest. The department's giving him a handler's home, safe, quiet, familiar faces." Caleb didn't reply at first. He turned to the fire, tossed another log in, and watched it catch. "He likes it here," he finally said. Jackson nodded, stepping closer. "I know, but he doesn't belong in the wild, not entirely, and—" He hesitated, then softened his tone. "He still perks up when he hears the dispatch tone, still looks for his vest. He's a soldier. Even if he never puts the gear on again, part of him needs to know he's home." Caleb looked down at his hands. "We all got ghosts." Jackson said nothing more. Outside, Ranger lifted his head, sensing movement. When the door creaked open, he stood, tail wagging once before settling still again, watching. As Jackson approached, Ranger walked over, not eager, not reluctant either, just steady. Jackson knelt, placed a familiar worn collar in his hand. "You ready, partner?" Ranger looked over his shoulder, back at the cabin, back at Caleb. There was a pause, a weight to it. The leaves shifted around them in swirls of wind, dry and whispering. Ranger took 3 slow steps toward the truck, then stopped, turned again. His eyes locked with Caleb's. The man said nothing, just nodded, slowly, a slight gesture of understanding. That was enough. The tail wagged once more. Then Ranger leapt into the back seat of the cruiser. The door shut softly. Jackson gave a respectful nod before driving down the winding path, tires crunching over gravel and dry leaves. Caleb stood motionless until the taillights disappeared behind the bend. The silence that followed felt heavier than any snowfall. That evening, the fire crackled as usual, but the room felt emptier. The worn spot on the rug by the hearth was bare. Caleb sat on his porch, a wool blanket over his knees, the wind teasing his hair, and a whiskey glass untouched beside him. He didn't cry. He just stared into the forest, where the last orange light faded between trees, and listened to the sound of nothing. A few days passed. Then Sophie returned. She showed up in her clinic pickup, hair messy, cheeks red from the mountain wind, and a large canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "Brought soup," she called, stepping into the cabin without knocking. "And someone's overdue for blood pressure meds." Caleb grunted, not looking up from the crossword puzzle in his lap. "Thought I raised you better than to barge in." "You didn't raise me at all," she shot back, but the edge had dulled. There was no bite in the words. Sophie was in her late 20s, but moved with the urgency of someone used to bad news. She had the same determined jawline as her father, Caleb's younger brother, and the same stubborn streak. She hadn't always been this concerned. For years, there had been space between them, thick with misunderstandings and quiet grief. After the accident that took her parents, she'd shut herself off from family, burying herself in books and animal shelters. But now, she came more often, not just as a vet, as something closer. "You miss him?" she asked after a while, as they sat on the porch, mugs in hand. Caleb didn't answer directly. Instead, he nodded toward the tree line. "Place feels too still. Even the birds are quieter." Sophie leaned back, scanning the woods. "I think he misses you too. Jackson said he wouldn't eat for 2 days after leaving here. They had to bring him one of your old flannels. Slept with it like a security blanket." Caleb chuckled. "A rare sound lately. Told you that shirt was lucky." They fell into a silence that wasn't awkward, just full. Later, when Sophie left, she placed a small radio on the table beside his armchair. "For when you don't want silence," she said. "I saved the station you like." She paused at the door, her voice quieter. "You did something good, Uncle, not just for him. For you, too." Then she was gone. That night, with the fire glowing and the radio playing a soft jazz tune, Caleb leaned back and closed his eyes. Ranger's blanket still lay folded in the corner. He didn't move it, not yet. The cold came early that year, sliding in under the ribs of autumn like a knife in soft cloth. Snow hadn't yet fallen in full, but the wind had turned bitter and sharp, and the sky remained the color of wet steel. The Appalachians had grown quiet, as they always did in the days before the first real storm. Animals stilled, creeks froze shallow, and the forest braced. Caleb Whitmore, now nearly 80, felt the weight of that stillness in his bones. His knees ached before sunrise, and his hands stiffened even when he wore his thickest gloves. But he remained stubborn, fiercely so, refusing help, brushing off doctor visits, and insisting on chopping his own wood. That morning, he had risen early, before Sophie's daily check-in call, determined to haul another load of firewood from the edge of his land. The cold wouldn't stop him, not yet. He layered up, canvas coat, wool scarf, leather boots older than most men's marriages, and set off with his axe and a canvas sack, teeth clenched against the biting wind. The path to the woodpile was old and winding, buried beneath leaves slick with ice. Caleb moved slowly but confidently, planting his boots with care. He was nearly there when it happened. One wrong step. A root, hidden beneath the brittle layer of ice, caught his boot mid-stride. His balance shifted. There was a crack, not from the forest, but from within him. Then came the fall, heavy and graceless, as he hit the frozen ground with a thud that knocked the air from his lungs. Pain shot through his right leg, bright and blinding. When he tried to sit up, the world tilted. His ankle, no, his shin. Something had snapped. Badly. "Damn it!" he muttered through clenched teeth, trying to roll to his side. The snow beneath him was shallow, but cruel. Cold soaked through his coat, through his skin, through the memory of warmth. He reached for the axe, but it had fallen just out of reach. His bag lay sprawled, half its contents spilled. He lay back, breath fogging upward, staring at the gray sky beyond the pines. No birds, no sounds, just wind. Back in Red Oak, Sophie Whitmore was finishing a long shift at the clinic. Her auburn hair was pinned back messily, and her scrubs were flecked with dog fur and iodine. The heater in her office clicked unevenly, and she wrapped herself in a cardigan as she cleaned up her last file. She reached for her phone, as she always did, to check if Uncle Caleb had messaged back. Nothing. Odd. She tried calling, no answer. She tried again, still nothing. He wasn't one to sleep during the day. Caleb was many things, cantankerous, old-fashioned, immune to cell phones. But he was not careless with check-ins. Ever since the incident with the black bear 3 years ago, he always answered by afternoon. She chewed on her thumbnail, pacing. After 15 minutes and 5 unanswered calls, the unease that had started as a whisper became a scream. Sophie threw on her coat and bolted for her truck. She didn't head straight for the cabin. Something in her gut told her not to go alone. Instead, she veered toward the Red Oak Sheriff's Department. Inside, the place was quiet except for the murmur of a police scanner and the hum of the vending machine. Behind the front desk sat Deputy Miguel Sanderson, a compact man in his early 40s with a weather-worn face and the calm manner of someone who had seen too much and still knew how to laugh. He looked up when Sophie entered, eyebrows raising slightly. "Doc Whitmore, you all right?" "No," she said, breathless. "I've been trying to call my uncle all afternoon. No answer. He was supposed to check in. He's not picking up." Miguel straightened in his chair. "You sure the line's not just down? Storm's coming. He's got the emergency phone, the landline. That one always works. And he never misses a check-in. Never." Miguel nodded slowly, rising. "All right, I'll notify dispatch. We'll get a team together before the roads ice over." "I'm coming with you," Sophie said immediately. Miguel gave her a long look. "Then suit up. It's going to be a cold one." Outside, the sky darkened quickly, early shadows creeping across the streets. Somewhere far in the woods, Caleb lay beneath a blanket of wind and silence, unaware that someone was already coming for him. The wind was a razor against bare skin, and the forest had gone from still to merciless. Snow drifted down in angry sheets, swallowing trails and landmarks alike, making every tree look like the last, and every step feel like a circle. The rescue team moved in deliberate silence, boots crunching through frostbitten leaves, flashlights carving through the storm like searchlights in a war zone. They were 5 in total, 2 deputies from Red Oak Sheriff's Department, a medic, Miguel Sanderson, and Sophie, wrapped in a red parka far too thin for the night she'd walked into. She gripped the radio tighter in her glove. "Any sign yet?" "Negative," came the deputy's voice. "No tracks. Storm probably wiped everything." Miguel scanned the dark, heavy pines. "He's out here somewhere. He wouldn't have gone far." Then came a bark, sharp, distant. Everyone froze. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a fox. It was too measured, too intentional. Sophie's heart jumped. That was a dog? Before anyone could answer, a figure emerged from the snow-covered path behind them, fast, graceful, low to the ground, but powerful. Ranger. His coat was dusted in white, but his movement was purposeful, driven by something more than instinct. His ears twitched as he paused, then barked once, short, clipped, as if to say, "Follow me." Jack Sinclair had brought him along last minute. Though the dog had retired years ago, something in Ranger had shifted when the call came in, pacing, whining, staring out the back window of the truck until Jackson gave in and opened the door. Now he was running ahead, tail low, muscles tight. He didn't hesitate. He knew. Sophie called out after him. "Ranger, is it him?" The dog barked again and took off toward the slope, his paws kicking up clouds of snow. The group followed without a word, urgency suddenly electric in the air. They reached a ridge that dropped into a narrow ravine between frozen creek beds and old spruce. There, nestled between 2 fallen trees, half covered in snow, was the still figure of Caleb Whitmore. Sophie's cry split the quiet. "Uncle!" She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. His face was pale, lips cracked and blue. One arm was twisted under him, the other curled over his ribs. Snow covered his coat, his boots, the brim of his hat. But he was breathing, shallow and slow, but breathing. "Oh my God, he's alive!" she gasped. The medic sprang into action, checking vitals. Miguel radioed for an immediate airlift. The team moved quickly, spreading thermal blankets, warming packs, stabilizing the leg that was now visibly broken mid-shin. Ranger sat off to the side, panting quietly, his eyes locked on Caleb. He didn't approach. He just waited. Caleb stirred, His eyelids fluttered, a low groan slipping from his throat. Then slowly, he turned his head. His vision was blurry, but through the flicker of snow and headlamp light, he saw a shape. Tall ears, black muzzle, steady eyes. A memory moved behind his eyes. Not dream, not ghost. Real. "Boone," he croaked, but then the dog moved closer, and Caleb saw him clearly. Ranger, older, grayer, but unmistakable. The dog walked forward and gently pressed his forehead against Caleb's shoulder, then pulled back. The contact was brief. Soft. "You came back," Caleb whispered, voice cracking with emotion. Ranger whined low in his throat, then turned to Sophie, then Jackson, then back to Caleb, almost as if checking the perimeter. "Sir," the medic said, "you're going to be all right. We're getting you out of here." Caleb closed his eyes, let the warmth of the heated blanket seep into his frozen limbs. But inside, what thawed faster was something else, something forgotten, something he'd let go, the feeling of not being alone. Back at the clearing, the rescue truck's engine idled. The helicopter couldn't land in the narrow woods, so the team would carry Caleb up the trail to the extraction point. They loaded him onto a stretcher, bundled him tightly, and began the ascent. Sophie walked behind, her hand resting on the stretcher rail, her other hand trembling despite the gloves. "You did it," she murmured to Ranger, who trotted silently at her side. Jackson appeared beside her, his breath visible in the frozen air. He tracked him like it was 2015 again, like he never missed a beat. "He knew," she said. "He just knew." Ranger gave a single bark, then fell into step beside the stretcher, never leaving Caleb's side until they reached the vehicle. Later that night, after the medics had stabilized Caleb in the town clinic and Sophie sat beside him, wrapped in 2 borrowed blankets, Ranger lay curled at the foot of the bed. Not barking, not pacing, just watching. Watching like he had 5 years before, when the roles had been reversed. And in his sleep, Caleb's hand drifted down the edge of the mattress and landed lightly in the ruff of Ranger's neck. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft hiss of the oxygen machine and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. White walls framed the small window, where snowflakes gathered at the edges of the glass, melting slowly into tiny rivers that slid down and disappeared. A vase of wilted chrysanthemums stood on a nearby counter, likely placed by a nurse with good intentions, but no sense of timing. At the foot of the bed, Ranger lay curled like a sentry, his eyes open and unwavering, his chest rising in calm rhythm. The once vibrant black in his coat had given way to flecks of gray that peppered his muzzle, the fur around his eyes softening into silver shadows. He was no longer the lean, sharp-edged canine from his service days. His movements had slowed, his frame slightly thickened with age, but he carried his presence with the same solemn pride. Caleb stirred under the white cotton sheets, his face worn and furrowed with lines that told a long, quiet story, turned toward the window as light crept in. A groan escaped him as he shifted slightly, his legs still elevated in a temporary cast, bandaged tightly. He blinked slowly until his eyes adjusted, and then he saw the dog. Ranger lifted his head as if he'd been waiting for that exact moment. He didn't move closer, not yet. He simply stared, calm, vigilant. Caleb smiled, dry and cracked. "Still keeping watch, huh?" With that, Ranger stood, walked to the bedside, and rested his head gently against Caleb's arm. Caleb laid a hand atop the dog's crown and let his fingers sink into the coarse fur. No words. Just warmth. The door creaked open moments later, and Sophie stepped in, carrying a steaming thermos in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. Her cheeks were pink from the wind outside, her reddish blonde hair hastily pulled into a low bun. She wore no makeup, but her eyes were bright and tired, the kind of look people wore when sleep had taken second place to care. "You're awake," she said softly, setting the bag down on the tray. "Thank God." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "I'm not dead. You can put the flowers on hold." Sophie gave a snort of amusement as she pulled up the visitor's chair. "It was either flowers or leftover bagels from the nurse's station. Consider this a favor." She poured him a cup of hot broth from the thermos and handed it to him. "You scared the hell out of me, old man." "I scared myself." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Ranger as he settled back down at the foot of the bed, his eyes never quite closing. "You know," Sophie said, lowering her voice, "he refused to leave your side the whole time. When they brought you in, he wouldn't even let the EMTs touch you at first, growled at one of them. Caleb chuckled weakly. Good boy. Jackson had to come to get him to back down. Even then, he stayed curled up at your bed like it was his post. Caleb's expression softened. It was. A knock on the door interrupted them. Jackson Clare stepped inside, dressed in his off-duty leather jacket and denim jeans, a badge clipped to his belt but half hidden beneath his coat. His beard had grown slightly, a dusting of frost still clinging to the edges of his collar. He looked relieved and just a little overwhelmed. Mind if I come in? Sophie gestured to the other chair. You better. He's due for a lecture about survival skills. Jackson gave a tight smile and sat. I brought something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, the contents shimmered. A medallion, embossed with the Red Oak Police Department seal and etched with the words, service, loyalty, life saved. For Ranger, Jackson said, voice low, we're holding a ceremony next week, small, just the town. The sheriff thought it would be right. The dog who saved a man who once saved him. It's not the kind of thing we forget. Caleb stared at the medal, throat tight. You sure he wants the attention? Jackson smirked. He won't care, but we will. Ranger, as if sensing his name, lifted his head again. Jackson looked at Sophie. We also talked about... What's next? Ranger's getting older. The department can't take him back. He's officially retired now. And he doesn't belong in a kennel, or with me and the kids. He needs somewhere quiet. Sophie glanced at Caleb, then back at the dog. I want to keep him, she said. For him, for my uncle, for all of us. He's not just a dog, he's... Family, Caleb finished. They didn't say much more. Later that afternoon, after Jackson left and the sun sank low behind the mountain ridge, casting a honey glow into the room, Sophie lay dozing in the corner chair. Caleb turned his head and looked once more at Ranger, still posted like a stone sentinel at the base of the bed. Guess we both get to grow old, huh? He murmured. Ranger didn't respond. He didn't need to. The room faded into stillness again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was whole. The snow melted slowly that year, as if the mountain itself were reluctant to release winter's hold. Patches of brown earth emerged between drifts of white, and the evergreens stood tall, dark, and proud, shaking the last of the frost from their branches like sleepy old giants. By the time the first crocuses poked their way through the thawing soil near the front steps of the cabin, the sun had returned, not yet strong, but warm enough to breathe life into things long still. Caleb Whitmore sat on the porch in his old rocking chair, wrapped in a flannel blanket that matched the checkered shirt beneath his coat. His leg, still healing, but no longer in a cast, stretched stiffly before him with a cane propped at his side. His face had grown more lined since the fall, but his eyes, that stormy Appalachian gray, were alive and bright as ever. At his feet, Ranger lay curled like a well-worn rug. His fur had gone salt and pepper with age, and the scars on his flank from his time in the woods were now little more than ripples beneath the coat. His breathing was slow even, his ears twitching at the chirp of birds returning to the forest. Sophie knelt in the garden bed near the porch steps. She wore denim overalls over a t-shirt, dirt smudged along one cheek and under her fingernails. Her long hair was pulled back with a paisley bandana, and despite the sweat on her brow, her expression was peaceful, focused. She gently patted the soil around a cluster of sunflower sprouts, the same kind Marion, Caleb's late wife, had once loved. "Those'll catch quick," Caleb said from behind her, his voice dry but proud. "They better. I've got a reputation to protect now," she replied without turning. A small yellow school bus, faded but still humming, was parked at the end of the trail road, just outside the old wooden signpost that marked the entrance to the Whitmore property. The new wooden plaque beneath it was freshly varnished, carved in careful block letters by one of Sophie's high school friends who worked in town as a carpenter. Trail Ranger, a path built by loyalty. Underneath it, in smaller script, in memory of the dog who came back and the man who once saved him. From the open porch, Caleb watched as a group of middle school children followed a young female teacher down the trail. She was tall and willowy, with long black hair braided down her back and a calm, patient energy. Her name was Miss Elena Rice, a first-year teacher from Asheville who had grown up loving stories about the forest and had brought her students to learn about conservation and, as she told Sophie on the phone, to meet a living legend. Caleb chuckled when she said it. Now, the children gathered in a half circle on the packed earth in front of the porch, their eyes bouncing between the old man in the chair and the sleeping dog at his feet. "Well now," Caleb said, shifting slightly in his seat, "I don't suppose you came all this way just to see an old man and his porch." The children giggled, and one boy raised his hand. "Is it true your dog saved your life?" Caleb tilted his head thoughtfully. "I reckon he did, though some say I saved his first." He told the story slowly, voice gravelly and warm. He spoke of finding Ranger in the snow 5 years ago, barely breathing, of watching him heal, then letting him go, of the long silence in the cabin after, and then the winter storm, the fall, the cold, and Ranger coming back, older but no less fierce, leading the rescue team like he was born for it. "He was never just a dog," Caleb said finally. "He was a soldier, a guardian, and after all those years, he didn't forget." Miss Elena wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. The children sat spellbound. Sophie stood in the background, arms folded, a smile tugging at her lips. Caleb reached down and scratched Ranger behind the ears. The dog didn't stir much these days unless food was involved, but now he thumped his tail once against the porch boards. "You know," Caleb said, voice softening, "they say what you give in kindness comes back to you. Maybe not right away, maybe not in the way you expect, but it finds its way." He looked out over the clearing, eyes distant, thoughtful. "I once gave a wounded dog a place to rest, a little warmth, a little soup, and a blanket by the fire. Didn't think much of it at the time. But 5 years later, that same dog found me in the woods when no one else could. He came back." He turned to the children again. "So, if you ever wonder whether it's worth helping someone, a person, an animal, even something small, I want you to remember this. What you give with love, life brings back to you, multiplied." The children clapped politely at first, then louder as the weight of the moment settled into them. Miss Elena nodded gratefully, mouthing, "Thank you." As the group gathered for a photo near the signpost, Sophie walked over and crouched beside Ranger. "He'll sleep all afternoon now," she said. "That much storytelling wears him out." Caleb chuckled. "He's earned it." She rested a hand on his shoulder, her fingers light. "So have you." The sun had risen higher now, casting golden light over the garden beds and across the porch. A robin perched on the railing for a breath, then fluttered off into the woods. And in the stillness, Caleb felt it again. Not the ache in his bones or the pull of time, but the quiet joy of belonging. Not just to a place or a family or a past, but to something greater, to the rhythm of giving and receiving, to the old trail, now named for a dog who never forgot, to the spring, come again. What you give with love, even when no one is watching, even when you expect nothing in return, has a way of finding its way back to you. Sometimes it's not in the form we imagine. Sometimes it's through a loyal dog. Sometimes it's a second chance. And sometimes it's a quiet miracle from God. This story reminds us that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and that even in the coldest winters of life, grace can still arrive, sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes through the people we least expect, always through love. If you believe that loyalty like this is a gift from above, if you believe that God still works in small, beautiful ways, type Amen in the comments to honor this bond, and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And may God bless you and everyone you hold dear.